Hello, and welcome to the Flatbill Pastor Podcast. My name is Marky Harrison, and I'm here with
Clinton Nolder.
All right, Clinton Nolder. How are you feeling today?
I feel delightful.
Why is that?
It's a good day.
Also,
Not too hot, not too cold.
that's right.
Yeah.
It's a nice spring day,
It is.
and we're also sipping upon coffees.
Yeah, coffee.
Sponsored by one of you.
Yeah, we had a sponsor. I didn't even know we could be sponsored.
Me neither. And Christian just came in and said, guess what?
Yeah.
Free coffee.
That's right. Shout out MK.
Yeah.
Thanks, MK. Wherever.
Thanks.
MK. Look what you got. I don't drink coffee, but look what you got me. You know what I'm saying? Now, Marky has.
I have actual coffee.
And you have two coffees.
Now, this is a trick of the film industry. We are actually drinking water out of this second cup.
Water.
Mm-hmm.
Water and coffee.
Yes, but actually, for those of you who can't see us, Clint is not drinking coffee at all.
Oh, that's right. I showed the camera like people on the other podcast can see.
Maybe you can show us with sound what you're drinking?
Well, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Come on. That's a Regal commercial right there. We're sitting in Regal. It's about to start. Okay, that's a good thing.
I'm not sure if I can say what it is.
Yeah. Well, we said it in the Queen's English the last podcast, but
Okay.
rhymes with Loca Lola.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I mean,
Rero.
there's zero sugar. It's a red can. You're pretty creative. That ride wasn't your best moment.
No, it's not my best work.
Yeah.
But we are talking about a great work
Yes.
of written art.
Yes. Did
aren't
we say thank you to MK? Because MK,
You did several times.
great. Thank you, MK.
Yes. Thank
Again.
you for the coffee. We are thoroughly enjoying ourselves.
That's right. And the zero sugar cola.
Mm-hmm. Today we are talking about something actually very important for those who claim they believe in Jesus.
Okay.
Claim that they believe in this book called the Bible.
Yeah.
We're talking about the reliability of the Bible
Mm-hmm.
because it's a pretty big deal, you know? I mean, we base everything we think and know and believe about God and Jesus and everything in between based on a book.
Yeah.
So I think to start the conversation about it, where did the Bible even come from?
Yeah. So this is a question that's, I would say, is posed often. And it's a question that even when it's not something that's communicated, I would imagine a lot of people wrestle internally with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are probably a lot of people that even say to themselves, I want to ask the question, but I'm afraid of how my Christian friends or the people in my church will view me if I were to say, hey, I've got questions about the Bible. Now, for our church at Foundation, we attempt to create an environment where people can ask any question they want.
Right.
Where if the question is in them, that we want to speak life and value into, hey, your questions deserve to be heard. And hopefully we could find a good answer for them. But I mean, there are some questions that I just have to be honest for. I don't have an answer. You're smiling at me. Why are we smiling?
Nothing.
Okay. Do I have a booger in my nose?
No, I was actually thinking about something else.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, great.
But it's fine. No, I agree. And I think a huge starting point for me talking about this question is establishing I didn't even think about this question until after I believed what the Bible said.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. They begin to really feel the truth of the Bible, and they take a step back and they're like, wait a second, I need to know a little bit more about the origins of this book.
Yeah.
And where it came from and why would I believe what it says anyway?
Yeah, the good news is that there are concrete answers for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it just takes a lot of time and digging into resources to put all the pieces together. When we look at the Bible as a whole, which is what most of us do, you can go to the store, Barnes & Noble, or wherever bookstore you want to, or Amazon, and you can pick up a completed version of the Bible. And there's a bunch of different versions, right? You got a King James version, NIV, ESV, all the, whatever V's. And you see it as a singular thing. But when you start to dig into it, you realize that it wasn't always that way, which I think growing up, I just assumed like, okay, well, the Bible was just written. But then the further you get into it, you realize that the Bible is composed of a lot of individual pieces that were written at different points in time that at some point was put all into one.
Right.
And so when we begin to take a look at that, I mean, goodness, let's just go over some specifics, right? So the Bible is broken into two distinct parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And when we look at those parts, there's, I think there's, 67 books in the Old Testament. 69 books total, 27 in the New Testament and 39 in the Old Testament. I think 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. Did that add 67? Yes. So, or 69? Let me actually check my notes.
Right?
66. Let me check. I have notes about this.
I didn't even go to Bible college.
I should probably know. 39, that's right. 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, 66. Yeah, there you go. I probably would fail a Bible college exam right now if I don't actually know that question, but
it's fine.
It is what it is. So in those distinct parts and pieces, each one of those parts have a lot of smaller parts, like individual books. There's 40 different people that contributed to writing the Bible. It's first started getting written and then finished with the last letter. The period was about 1,500 years.
Oh, wow.
So it's not like it was all one sitting. So 40 different folks or so, 40 or so authors. We don't know. We're not sure exactly who wrote every single book. We have some really great hints and really good, I think we can make some really good assumptions, but it's not 100% clear in every book who wrote it.
Were there like scribes?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of times that someone would write on behalf of someone who is dictating something to them, for sure.
That's such a boss move.
It is. I sometimes wish I had a scribe. And then Siri tells me that there's this thing called like Dragon software, and I could use it if I wanted to. I think it's called Dragon.
I mean, I use talk to text all the time.
Yes.
But it sounds like I don't know English because it's very broken most of the time.
That's exactly what mine sounds like too. Yeah, Siri doesn't speak Southern for some reason.
No, she doesn't.
So when we look at that, those 40 authors or so use 3 different languages to write the Bible. And so when we take a look at the Bible, we see, man, so many individual pieces and we start to put them together. When we look at the history of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, they're 2 different narratives in terms of how we got them and the collection of those books. And so I don't think we have enough time for us to really walk through all of it. But I think most people would say, hey, what I'm really interested in, because the whole idea of Christianity like hinges on, is Jesus legit? Right. So if Jesus is legit, then you begin to put the other pieces in place. And so if we concentrate on the New Testament and the New Testament alone, we know that the first part of the Bible started to be written about 40 years or so after Jesus was crucified, on the cross. And it just kind of goes from there. And it takes about 100 years or so for the whole thing to be written.
Okay.
And
that's the whole Bible?
That's the New Testament.
New Testament.
Yeah, the New Testament. And so you get to 130, 140 AD, and the New Testament itself isn't compiled as the New Testament. If you were to ask someone in 100 AD, hey, do you have a copy of the New Testament, or let's turn to the Bible, they would have they had no idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
You take those individual pieces and parts, and the churches, they begin using those individual pieces. So one of the big contributors to the New Testament was a guy named Paul. He was a church planter. And Paul plants these churches all over, and he begins to write letters to them and correspondence. And he receives letters from them. And so they go back and forth. And so the letters that he writes, some of those letters are taken because of the content in the letters and what he addresses. And it's not only specific to that particular church that he planted, but it's applicable to every church.
Okay.
And so people start sharing his letters with other churches like, hey, you should take a look at how he addresses this issue or this thought process. And so there's a number of those that we know today is a part of the Bible.
Right. But it's still like a letter, like,
Yes.
hey, guys. Hey, Brad.
Right.
Hey, Karen. Like that kind of thing, like still addressing his homies, and then
Yes.
tells them specifics about their congregation, so to speak, or their group of people and the church essentially that they've created together. And he talks to them specifically about their own specific problems and,
Yes.
concerns.
Yeah. I mean, he's got names of friends. He addresses them to the church or to those friends. He talks about the friends that are with him that are bringing the letter to them. And then he almost always the letters are addressing issues the church is experiencing or questions that the church has. And he just says, hey, I'm going to take it upon myself to answer these questions because I have the answer, or I have the instructions to give you for how to solve this problem. And then the church that receives it realizes, you know what, we're probably not the only people that have these same questions or struggle with these same issues. And so they begin to circulate them. And so those letters get circulated. And so he'll write a letter to the church at Corinth, right? 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so he'll write those letters, but then churches in Ephesus and the church in Rome and the church in Jerusalem, and they'll want to read those letters. And so they'll start copying them by hand. And so they can't send the original, right? They want to keep the original. And so they'll start making copies of them, and then they'll send a copy of that letter to the next church.
So this is like reading somebody else's mail.
It is very much
just
so.
Carbon copy of the mail. Wow.
What's even cooler is not only were they giving it to other churches, there were copies that were being made when a city were to receive one of those letters. They would be planting smaller churches in the smaller places nearby, not just the big cities that we talk about,
right,
but these smaller. So they were making copies and they were sending it out to these tinier churches in cities that were next door to them, not just really big cities far away. And so what we find is the church as a whole begins to adopt these letters of instruction and these letters of answers to questions. And they adopt them as, you know what, this brings some unity, because we all have the first set of unity we have is we have the same struggles.
Right.
And a lot of us have the same questions. And now we've got unity in the answer.
Yeah.
Now, what matters is that the answers were coming from someone who was on a very specific mission from Jesus. And so Paul was a persecutor of the church. Paul actually oversees the execution of Christians and the imprisonment of Christians. In fact, he makes it his mission to go from city to city and arrest Christians and put them in jail. And that he spends his entire life up to a certain point, and that's all he's about. And this is after the crucifixion of Jesus. And then he has an encounter with Jesus on a road to a city called Damascus. And he is headed there to arrest more Christians. And he has a confrontation with Jesus, and Jesus just says, hey, why do you persecute my church? Like, why do you continue to do this to me? And they have a conversation. And the thing is that the confrontation with Jesus, Paul describes it himself as it was this bright light. No one else saw what happened. They saw Paul reacting, but nobody else saw, this Jesus that he claims that he saw.
So Jesus was alive and he was just on his way to his next meeting, or?
No, Jesus had already resurrected. Jesus was gone. Jesus appears to Paul, according to the Bible.
Okay.
And most people think he's nuts, right? And honestly, when I read this story, it's like, this is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. A grown man's riding a horse to arrest some guys, and there's a bright light, and the light talks to you. Yeah, that's absurd.
Sounds a little bit like Teletubbies.
Very Teletubby-ish. However, what's not Teletubby-ish is the change that occurs in his life because of this. And so Paul, in just a few days, goes from, I'm arresting every Christian I can find, I'm going to execute the ones that I can, and I'm here to 100%, my life's mission is to put a stop to the Jesus movement. and a switch flips, and all of a sudden he becomes a champion of the movement he wanted to put out.
Right.
And instead of persecuting them, he begins to propel the mission forward and sending people and sending himself to plant churches all over the Roman world. And when people ask him, why are you doing this? His response is, I saw the resurrected Jesus.
Right.
And that's his only explanation. He said, I got nothing else. When I talk to people and I tell them, look, I've got a resume a mile long. I have achieved everything in terms of my professional career as a religious scholar and a teacher as one could possibly achieve. I have the education, I have the background, I have the wealth, I have Roman citizenship. I've got it made. But there's just something I can't do anything other than further the Christian movement because of what I saw in Jesus. And that changes everything. So Paul begins to write these letters.
Mm-hmm.
So the authority that he has in this work is enormous. I mean, he has a confrontation with Jesus himself, a resurrected Jesus, and just flat out has his entire life changed. And so he begins to put the church first, even above himself. And he sacrifices the rest of his known life to planting churches and to telling people that Jesus was a real person and he died on a Roman cross and he resurrected from the dead, and that Paul himself saw him. And because of that has changed his life. And so Paul begins writing these letters. Other people write letters, but Paul writes a significant portion of what we know as the New Testament in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so these letters start to circulate. And they circulate for a couple hundred years. The church, the local church, knows these letters, but no one has put them all together. No one's put the letters together. No one's put the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No one's put those together with Paul's letters in one big complete volume. And there's a bunch of others, right? There's, like I said, 27 different pieces of the New Testament. But all of a sudden, you start getting to 200-300 AD, and the conversation starts to happen about, hey, shouldn't we put all of these in the same thing? Because there's a couple of other guys that show up that start giving an alternative view of what should be what we know today as the Bible. There's this one guy named Marcion. He shows up. He's an incredibly wealthy ship owner. And he submits, hey, this is what our Bible should be, or this is what our collection should look like. And he leaves out a lot, like a whole lot of what we know as the Bible today. And the church is like, no, we've been reading these letters and circulating these letters for centuries now, or at least a century and a half. We're not going to leave these out. But he was very uncomfortable with some of the things that it said, some of the things that it called people to. And he wasn't a religious scholar. He was just a rich guy who said, hey, this is what I want.
Okay, so who's to say that the existing churches just decided what they wanted? How did we come up with what should be in and what's not in?
Yeah. So there's three big criteria that we kind of take a look at. One of them is church-wide acceptance. And so it's one thing for one church to want something. It's another thing for every single church in the church. Because at this time, it wasn't like it was global. It wasn't like we were, in Australia and Africa, South America, North America. Like the church wasn't in all those places. I mean, it was growing, but it wasn't to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So all of the churches in that network had adopted, hey, they had the Bible before we even called it the Bible, is really what we're trying to say, is that they didn't put them all together, but they used them all together.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't in the same binding of a book like they are now, but they were still thought of with the same authority and the same value. And so when someone else said, hey, we don't want to do that, if all the other churches were like, why would we leave out this letter that Peter wrote? Like, we know he wrote it. Why would we not want to, just because it makes you uncomfortable, because it asks you to live in a specific way? Why would we want to do that? I mean, Jesus calls us to live in a way that's different than everybody else does. So they begin having those conversations, and church-wide acceptance is a big deal. Well, one of the other things is the attachment to an apostle, right? To one of the closer friends of Jesus. One of the guys who were there and witnessed what the Bible talks about and the the theories that come from how to live our life comes from experiences.
That's why they're like, yeah, you can't leave out Peter.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
You can't leave that out. He was there.
He lived life with Jesus. So when he writes something and says, this is what Jesus said, I mean, it's a firsthand interview account of, hey, what happened when this event took place? I mean, the greatest evidence we have in a courtroom today is an eyewitness.
Yeah.
And so when there's an eyewitness to what happened, then we take that account seriously. And so a connection to an apostle or a really close associate, so a scribe, someone who worked with them. A lot of people think that the Gospel of Mark is a really close associate with Peter.
Okay.
And so that was another criteria. So church-wide acceptance, a close association with, or an actual written version from an apostle. And the third one is it's just called orthodoxy, or it's the idea of, is it right? Do they all agree with one another, or is there contradiction?
Mm-hmm.
And so if Paul writes something and then someone else writes something and they contradict with one another, well, then we've got to decide which one is true, right? And so we can't say that, the sky is blue and someone else say, well, no, the sky is green, and put them both in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And then it leaves us in a place of, well, which one do we believe? And the good news is that we've got so much apostolic precedent or apostolic writing that when we have someone who's not quite on the level of an apostle, someone who was there, an eyewitness to what happened, we can compare it to those things to see, hey, is there agreement, or is there some disunity? Is there something that disagrees with what we already know to be true?
Right, because there's so many different accounts of the same story.
Yes, right. So when we have that agreement, then that helps build the case that, hey, this is what the Bible should look like. Now, that being said, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they describe similar incidents, but they're not all identical in terms of how they say it happens. It's from a very specific point of view. And not only is it from a very specific point of view, they also have different objectives that they're trying to accomplish. For instance, Matthew is a Jewish guy. And so when he's writing, he's trying to make a case to his Jewish brothers and sisters that Jesus is birthed from Judaism and that Jesus fulfills what Judaism has been looking and hoping for. And so he writes it to a Jewish audience with that frame of mind. Whereas Luke, on the other hand, is writing from a historian's perspective. And so he talks a lot about Roman history and very specific political figures and places and events that allow it to be, and what ends up being, when we look into the evidence, an incredible historical document.
Okay, so you're talking about historical documents. Who's to say that they didn't just make all this up and they just decided it sounded good, and so they made a bunch of copies?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What is historical about it?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big questions that everyone wants to ask, and I encourage the question. So as I've looked into it, and there's a lot of resources that we can point to, but I'll just give you a little bit of something. In fact, I've got some notes here, which is good because obviously I didn't remember how many books are in the Bible a while ago. So it's
it's all right. I am here.
Thank you.
With my West Georgian education.
I appreciate that. So I've got some things that are written down just to kind of help, because I think that there is such a really great and strong case for the historical reliability of the Bible.
Okay.
And we get that only because, and I say it's a strong case because I believe that that the case for the Bible is equal to, if not better than, what we already accept and admit in our society as historical evidence.
Okay.
So when we think through like a world history class that you would take in high school, or even an advanced world history class in college or graduate school, there are some ancient writings that are referred to and used as pieces and evidence of history that we just assume are telling the truth.
Okay.
I'll give you a couple of instances, right? So there's a Roman historian named Tacitus, and he's known as one of the greatest Roman historians. So we look at the history of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
His writings are used just nonstop. In fact, if we only had Tacitus' writings, we would have a significant portion of Roman history still able to teach just weeks and weeks and weeks on the history of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Right. And so when when we look at his writings, his two most probably most popular works are called the Annals and the Histories, and they examine the reigns of the emperors Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. Right, so AD 14 to around 96 AD. Okay,
All right.
so it was written. We know it was written around 100 AD. The earliest manuscript or copy of that work that he put together that we have is around 1100 AD. So he wrote it in 100. We have a copy of it that dates back to about 1100 AD. So 1,000 years after he originally wrote it, we've got evidence that it was written, right? So we've got a copy of it. That's we don't have his original. We have a copy that was written or copied from his, writing 1,000 years later.
I wonder how they know how old it is. Not that you would know, but I'm just
No,
curious.
so the way that we would know it is it was probably dated. Like, hey, we're making this copy, and maybe a library was making a copy of it or a handwritten copy, because that's how all of them were done then. And they would put a date on it to say, hey, this is when this copy was made. The question is what did they make the copy from, right? And how old was that copy? Because it wasn't like they made it up on their own. So they were handwriting a lot of times word for word, or sometimes they would do line for line, but most of the times word for accuracy's sake. And so they would, take a look, and they would move from one parchment to the other, and they would put a date on. Yeah. Well, I doubt they were using papyrus in 1100, but at the beginning, for sure, that's what they were using. And so when we look at that, 1,000 years after he originally wrote it, we've got 20 copies of his works that are handwritten manuscripts, right?
Okay.
Now, I'm not talking about 20 copies of books that are now in libraries across college campuses or at Barnes & Noble, but in terms of the handwritten copies, they're ancient manuscripts. We've got 20 copies of that, right? Another one is the writings of Thucydides, which I was wondering when I was prepping for this, how would closed captions pick up Thucydides? And so I figured I would say Thucydides, and just because I'm curious to see what's going to happen with it.
We'll see.
You're welcome. I guess so. Okay. Anyway, so he writes the history of the Peloponnesian War, which recounts the 5th century BC war between Sparta and Athens, right? So this is a big deal.
Sparta.
That's right, Sparta. And so that's a very historical document. It was written in 460 to 400 BC, somewhere in there. We have the earliest evidence of that, or a copy, around 900 AD. So the first copy we have is 1,400 years after it was originally written, and we've got 8 of those. Okay.
Okay. So now, 20 and 8.
That's right, 20 and 8. So I've got a huge list, but honestly, all the lists are the same, right? So someone writes something, it's a well-known historical document, and by the time we get to where we have proof, it's been 900 or 1,000 or 1,400 years. It's the same story. I have a huge list here in front of me, but I don't want to bore the listener with all of them. However, when we get to the New Testament, we know it was written between AD 40 and 100, right?
Okay.
The earliest pieces of manuscript that we have come around 130 AD. So depending on where it's at, between 30 and 90 years after it was originally written. Right. So the other historical documents we talk about are hundreds of years, it could be up to 900 years. But for the New Testament, we're within 30 or 90 years of when we have the first fragments of a manuscript. We have our first full manuscript of the New Testament in 350 AD, right? So only 250 years after it was finished, we have our first full manuscript. And of that, we've got 5,000 Greek manuscripts, about 10,000 Latin, and 9,000 in other languages, compared to 5, 8, 20 of the other things. Right?
Okay. So I wonder though, like my mind immediately goes to what makes the New Testament, the contents of that were copied, and the full manuscripts that we have of the whole Bible. What makes that more accessible to be copied? Like what are the factors? One factor I'm noticing is that in most of the historical documents we're looking at is the fact that most of them were written BC. One of them, I think, was written in AD 100 AD. And the New Testament is 40 to 100 AD.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that has anything to do with it, or like what languages are these other documents written in? Where were they kept? I mean, we kind of talked about earlier the New Testament. A lot of it's letters that were sent to groups of people.
Right.
So I think that makes a difference, right?
It makes a huge difference. I think it's the motive behind why people want copies and manuscripts of the letters.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the contents of the history of the Peloponnesian War, so there's not a bunch of families who are sitting around thinking, you know what? I think I'd like to have a copy of that because that helps my life.
Right.
Whereas when we get into church history and these letters that were written, everyone wanted a copy of them. Every single church wanted a copy of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when Paul writes something and they want to spread it to other churches, and then you go 50 years down the road and those churches have these letters and they realize, hey, these are valuable. They're not, every church doesn't have a library like a central city. Like Rome would have a library.
Mm-hmm.
Those cities would have libraries where they're not housing all of these. And like a lot of times churches just had them and they would make copies and they wanted to make sure that they lasted.
Right.
And so they would make copy. And at the end of the day, the content of it was so valuable to our independent individual lives that it makes sense that there's more manuscripts. It also makes sense because as you begin to traverse continents, yeah, I mean, it was the history of the Peloponnesian War or Socrates or whatever that is. It's important to that culture.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus began to be important to any culture because Jesus is a universal solution to a universal problem. And it doesn't matter what culture you're in or what language you speak or where you're from, Jesus is still the answer. And so when we begin to look at language translations and moving from where it was written in the original Greek into other languages, there's this need and this desire that says, hey, I want to understand this in my heart language. So let's figure it out. And so there's just a different motivation for the copies and making manuscripts than almost any other historical document. I mean, history is history, right? We have it and it's important. But what we were finding about Jesus is that no one viewed the letters of Paul or the Gospels as history. They viewed them as life-changing revelation that was relevant to them right now. It wasn't just about, hey, let's not forget how we built the nation we've got today. It was, no, what happened when Jesus was walking the earth and when these guys were planting these churches is relevant to me right now. I want to know.
So I totally agree. Like that makes a lot of sense thinking about it from a standpoint of like, yeah, this is applicable to the multitudes, you know, it's not just applicable to people who care about the history of things
Right.
and what has happened in human history. But who's to say like Jesus wasn't made up by then and really it's just a time traveler with an LED light, you know, like who's to say, like, do we have any accounts of like Jesus being written by people who have nothing to do with believing in him, Christianity, like,
yeah,
like that I feel like is a huge indicator that like, yeah, Jesus was a real guy.
right. Yeah. So I think that's a different question. So the first question that you asked was, hey, is the Bible reliable? And when I think about reliability, I'm thinking in terms of the way we process other historical documents, can we make a similar or better case that what was originally written in the Bible is the same thing that we read today?
Mm-hmm.
Just like if we were to say, hey, when we look at the history of the Peloponnesian War, or we look at Socrates' writings or Plato's writings, which are all a part of this list that I've got, right? We believe that what we read is what Plato wrote.
Yeah.
So we're asking, when we say, is it reliable? Has it withstood the test of time to where we know that what we read today is what the apostles wrote, what the church planters wrote, what the friends of Jesus wrote? And we can see that if we use only the evidence we use for any other ancient historical document, that the Bible exceeds that in terms of evidence to make a case that it is reliable, that it is what they wrote. Now, the question you're asking now is not, are we reading what they wrote, but is what they wrote actually true?
Right. So,
right?
I mean, we have works like, I mean, everyone believes that Beowulf, you know,
Sure.
existed. Like,
Right.
sure, but it's a story. Like, what makes it history?
Right. Right. So we know that Beowulf is what was written. The question is there any accuracy to it? Right.
Right.
So when we ask the question, hey, are the people and places that the Bible talk about, did they actually exist, or were they a fantasy or a fairy tale? Now, when we begin to look at that, we can't use the Bible as proof anymore. It's
Right.
circular reasoning, circular logic, right? We can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. And so when we begin to look at other historical pieces to this, the first place we want to look at is a place that cannot lie, and that is dirt, right?
Okay.
Let's do some digging, and let's look at some archaeology.
Archaeology.
That's right.
All right.
Now, here's the cool thing about archaeology is that it's a record you can't get rid of.
Mhm.
You know, because the nature of archaeology, it's so far beneath the surface of the earth, you don't even know sometimes where to look to get rid of the evidence if you wanted to.
Mhm.
And so there's no telling what you're going to uncover when you start to sift through the dirt of ancient ruins. The only thing that is for sure is that it's going to tell the true story of what took place there. So when we look at archaeology as a whole, until about 200 years ago, archaeology was one of the greatest things to disprove the Bible. In fact, the Bible talked a lot about places and people that no one else in history had ever heard of.
Right.
Like a lot of that. However, at around the mid 1800s, things started to change. And all of a sudden, biblical archaeology became a thing. Up until then, it wasn't a thing.
So it was like up until then we weren't finding anything that added up.
It wasn't that they weren't. It was. Are we even looking, right?
Okay.
Or do we even have control of the land in order for us to look? You
Mm.
know, and we really see an enormous change in the 1950s when the state of Israel becomes officially a state. The United States recognized the nation of Israel as a legitimate state.
Mhm.
And when that happened, all of a sudden, the ability to do some digging and look into some history became a legitimate thing. And it's just in the last 70 years that we've done substantial work in the Middle East, in and around the area that Jesus walked and talked, to uncover some of the truths. And here's the really cool thing is that over the last 70 years, what we have found over and over and over again is that every single archaeological find continues to prove what the Bible says.
Okay.
And in fact, there's a guy named Nelson Glueck, Gluek is his last name,
Okay.
one of the top 3 archaeologists of the 20th century. He said this: "It may be clearly stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a single biblical reference."
Hmm.
In other words, the more they dig, the more they confirm that what was written in the Bible was true and accurate. When you look at the Gospel of Luke, we talked about Luke being a historian. In particular, what we have found over the last 50, 60 years is that Luke knows more about Roman history and the nuances of small Roman towns than a lot of the larger historians.
Mhm.
And there were things that he talks about that the larger historians didn't talk about because they were writing from Rome. And so they weren't in
Right.
some of these smaller pocketed areas. And so there were people he talks about and things that he talks about. It's just like, we've never heard of this before. But as they're starting to dig in these tiny towns, they're finding inscriptions that match up identically with the way that Luke described it.
Okay.
And Roman historians are going crazy, like, this is incredible.
Mhm.
And what they don't realize, or that what they soon come to realize as soon as the Bible scholars get a hold of it, is they're like, hey, we already knew this. So much so that there's an enormous community that's starting to look at the Gospel of Luke as a historical record. Even if they're not followers of Jesus, he did that good of a job.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, even more than the archaeological evidence that we have that the places and the people in the Bible were real, which, and I don't want to undersell that. I guess let me push pause for a second.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the greatest arguments that the Bible is reliable is because if when I say we, if followers of Jesus wanted to kind of skirt around the truth, there's a way to do that for an audience. It's like a fortune teller.
Mhm.
You go to a fortune teller and all of a sudden the fortune teller is telling you all these general things that like could be applicable to anybody.
You are in a relationship.
That's right. The Bible is so specific,
Mhm.
both in terms of people and places and time and events and things that are outside of Christian world event, they are so specific. It's like they were setting themselves up to be discovered to be a hoax, or they were just telling exactly what was happening in front of their own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And you just can't undersell how specific they were when they wrote the Bible. It's like it never even entered their mind that they would have to make a case to defend their work. They just simply told the truth.
Right. So it's like they set the stage, like, this is where we're at in the world. This is what's happening.
That's it. And there was no thought that they would have to defend it. They were just like, well, this is what's happening. Why would we defend it? This is exactly what's happening. If you look at the narrative of the resurrection of Jesus, even that is a dumb move for them, unless they're just telling what happened. Their primary first witnesses of the resurrection is a bunch of women,
Mm-hmm.
which in the first century means nothing. They can't even go to court and be a witness, right? Yet they're using them in the narrative of like the biggest moment in history, that if it's not true, everything falls apart for an enormous piece of our world.
Right.
And the very first piece of evidence they offer is there's a bunch of girls.
Right. They're like, yeah, so we're going to tell the story, but
Yeah.
so there were two women.
Yeah. Which in today, right, it's a different story. But for them, it was just dumb. If they're trying to fabricate a lie that is bulletproof,
They wouldn't use it.
You would not start your story with a bunch of ladies went to the tomb and they saw an empty tomb and Jesus resurrected. No, they would have sent the most educated, the most well-written and well-spoken guys to the tomb, and they would have told the lie that they're the ones who saw them, and then they would write this elaborate story that is just, you just can't penetrate it at all. There's no holes in it. It just can't be done. It is just solid.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what they did. And that's completely beside the point. But I'm just saying the more you dig into the specifics behind the Bible, the better the case gets. But even beyond all that, let's just say that Luke was a great historian, that he does know Roman culture, that he does understand what's happening in the times and the events.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, none of that matters to me personally. What matters to me personally is, tell me about Jesus.
Right. Like, I mean, even if Luke is being recognized as a great historian of the day, like, where else are we seeing that Jesus was a real guy?
Right.
Like,
Yeah, so
that's kind of what matters to me. If I'm thinking about the Bible and how reliable and trustworthy and accurate it is, like, I need to know that Jesus actually existed.
Right. And you would think if Jesus was as significant as the biblical writers say he is, that someone else outside of Christianity and Judaism would have recognized or saw him.
Exactly.
Right?
Like, he's stirring the pot majorly.
Yes.
And so surely somebody wrote something down about that.
Right. And thankfully, they did. Right.
Oh, okay.
How about that? So I got a list. I don't want to go through the whole list. I just want to give you a few highlights that I think are pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've even got one from the Jewish faith, but let's just leave anyone, just for the sake of time, let's leave anyone connected to any religion that is connected to Christianity out.
Yeah.
Let's leave anyone connected to any religion out when it comes to them talking about Jesus. So let's just talk about Roman historians.
Okay.
Okay. Or Roman officials. There's a guy named Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor. And this is what he wrote. He wrote about this. He said, there's a group of Christians that refuse to worship the emperor's image. Now, that doesn't prove there was a Jesus. It just proves that there's a Roman governor who's aware of a crew of folks. The name attached to them are Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got this thing in their mind that will not allow them to worship any other image, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the truth is that would be the same thing for Jewish people. So that's nothing different. That's nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing he wrote, though, this is pretty interesting. He writes about a group of Christians that meet together and sing hymns to Christ as if to a God. Now, he doesn't call Christ a God. He just says, I'm aware that this same group who won't worship the emperor's image will get together and worship this Christ guy,
mm-hmm.
and they worship him like he's a God, right?
Okay.
So that's one guy. There's another guy named Suetonius. He was a Roman historian. He wrote most famously about Emperor Claudius in AD 49, expelling the Jews due to a riot in Rome that was caused at the instigation of Christus, which is a reference to Jesus Christ, right?
Okay.
There's another guy named Tacitus, which we mentioned previously, this incredible Roman historian. He says this. He says, the name Christian comes from Christ, a person who had been executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius.
Okay, so these last two are the ones that really mention Jesus
Yes.
as a person.
100%. Yeah. So Tacitus, not that he knows Christ or knows Jesus, which is interesting that evidently the name Christ has been attached almost like a proper name, right? And Jesus is his actual name, but
Right.
this Jesus Christ is the name Christian comes from Christ. And then he says Christ is a person who had been executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Doesn't say that Jesus is God or the Son of God or that he resurrected from the dead, just that he was a person. He's got this Christ title to him and he was executed.
Right. Just like a footnote and aside, like, hey, by the way.
He also gives the time frame for the death of Jesus around AD 26 to 36, somewhere in there, right?
Okay.
There's another. He also talks about how the followers of Jesus increased in number after his execution from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. And so there was something that happened after the crucifixion of Jesus that caused an explosion in the number of people who believed in him, right? Now, it's easy to say, well, that's what a martyr does. You kill someone for a cause, people start following it, right? I get it. That's not proof, right? It's just someone else saying, hey, Jesus was a legitimate person, and for sure he was executed, and he had a bunch of followers.
Okay.
Last one is there's a guy named Thallus, Roman historian. He writes about the darkness during the crucifixion in the middle of the day, right? Which is what the Bible also talks about. In all, I got a little list, so because I didn't go through the whole list, but here's what people who are not connected to Christianity have written about Jesus. And when we look at this list, the important thing to remember is that everything else these people wrote, we take as history.
Okay.
So we teach in college classes, we teach in high school history classes. They also have some things about Jesus. And so I would think that we would put their asides or their few sentences about this Jesus character at the same level of authenticity and trustworthiness as anything else they say about their history. This is what we find. Just there's 11 things that we know about Jesus because of what people wrote that have no connection to Christianity. Number one is that he was Jewish. Number two is that he lived in the first third of the first century. Number three, people believe that he was born out of wedlock.
Okay.
Right? Number four, that he did wondrous feats. Right?
Okay,
That he did some
like,
things that were just like, man, there's inexplainable.
Okay.
Right? Number five, he gathered disciples. So he had a crew. Number six, he lived in conflict with the Jewish authorities. Right? So he's creating some friction. Number seven, a sorcerer that led the people of Israel astray, right? So one person sees it as he does some pretty wondrous things. Someone else says, no, it's straight like
he's a wizard.
He's a wizard. That's black magic, Slytherin. For sure, leading Israel astray. Number eight, some believed in his crew that he was the Messiah. Number nine, he was crucified by Pilate. Number 10, he was believed to be seen raised from the dead by those who followed him, and they now worship him as a god, right? Not this person's not saying they saw him. It just says he was believed to be seen raised from the dead by his followers who now worship him as a god. And number 11 is that he had a brother named James, and that brother was martyred in AD 62 by the high priest.
Okay.
Now, what's really interesting about that is that James, according to the Bible, did not believe in Jesus growing up. In fact, he thought Jesus was crazy, like certifiably insane, crazy. Yet for some reason, he spends his entire life thinking his older brother is just out of his mind. But for some reason, after the crucifixion of his brother, something happened that caused him to believe his brother was no longer crazy. So much so that James becomes an instrumental part of the church in Jerusalem and eventually loses his life and is martyred because of what he believes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I gotta say, if my brother was doing all that kind of mess, I'd say, dude, y'all, you're just crazy. Yeah, you're out of your mind. I don't believe it.
I don't know anyone who didn't grow up with an older brother that didn't think he was God. So I think it's probably justifiable that James is like, yeah, well, my older brother's just got a God complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think when we think through the historical reliability of the Bible, there's a few things that we can kind of summarize that we do have proof for. The first one is that what the first century wrote and what they read and what they followed is what we have in our Bible today.
Okay.
Now, whether it's accurate or not, whether it's trustworthy or not, like that's not what that statement is saying, but what they wrote is what we've got. The second thing is that each archaeological dig further confirms the existence of the Bible, both places and people.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So if we can just keep digging, almost like swimming.
Yeah.
Right. If we can just keep digging, we will continue to find more proof. And here's the thing. I'm not even afraid of what we will find when we dig. I'm let fund the whole thing, dig the whole thing up, because the truth is, if what I've been giving my life to is a lie, I would like to know so I can move on with some other things.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I'm not scared of you disproving Jesus. In fact, you would be doing me a favor if you did.
Yeah.
You know? But I'm not interested in your half-hearted, well, this is what I think, this might lead to this. No, there's so much evidence that Jesus was a real person. There's so much evidence that we have here that what the Bible that we have today is what was written 2,000 years ago. There's so much evidence. You got to come with something pretty concrete, not just I feel this.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
And I think that's an important thing to consider when you're even asking this question. Like, if you're asking this question, you need to be ready to actually answer it and not just think like, okay, I just need one or two quick facts to be able to make a point. I think it's important that if you genuinely want to answer this question, that you consider all of this information together and, you know, be ready to disprove what you already think.
Yes.
Because there's no point in even doing the work to answer the question if that's the case.
Right. Yeah. A lot of times when we want to go prove or disprove something, that's what we do. We Google the question we want to be answered.
Right.
And so, and when it comes to, hey, I want to prove whether or not the Bible is reliable or not, we would if we want it to be unreliable, we Google, why is the Bible unreliable? And then we get our answers. If we want the Bible to be reliable, then we Google, why is the Bible reliable?
Right.
And then we get our answers. Whereas that's the wrong question, right?
Yeah.
The question we need to be asking is, tell me everything you know about the authors of the Bible. Tell me everything you know about the transcription process of the Bible. Tell me everything you know about the process where we get manuscripts. Tell me everything you know about the original manuscripts that we have. Tell me everything you know about where they were found. Tell me everything you have on X, Y, and Z. And then you dig into that and then you come to a conclusion.
Right.
But a lot of times we come up with in our head what we want to be true and then we search for it. And of course we find what we're looking for. We can find whatever you want to believe is true, you can find it.
Right.
You know?
And yeah, and I think this is when I started asking this question for myself for the first time, it was very much so kind of a symptom of like, yeah, I'm actually really starting to believe something's different about Jesus and the Bible. And I think if you are genuinely feeling stirred to answer this question, you need to do yourself a favor.
Yes.
Like, you need to do the work because otherwise you're just going to be living your life on a hunch. And, you know, that's just kind of upsetting. It's upsetting for everyone involved, you know?
Honestly, you're worth the effort to find a legitimate answer to your legitimate question.
Right.
Your life is worth it.
Right.
Because what Jesus is asking us to do is to give our life and to deny ourselves. And if that's not legit, well, then there's something else we're supposed to be doing. So let's not waste it on a myth. Let's not waste it on a Disney fairy tale,
Right.
you know? And I just think you're worth more than that. I want to think I'm worth more than that. And
Exactly.
I don't want to wake up and waste my life on something that's just a fairy tale. I
Yeah.
want something more than that. Now, that being said, the work itself, while it will get us to a conclusion where we will find, hey, there's some historical accuracy to the Bible. We will find that there's enough history and historical evidence that Jesus was a legitimate person.
Mm-hmm.
We will find that there is currently no proof that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead. And there are armies of people that have been searching for 2,000 years to disprove that. No one has any evidence
Mm-hmm.
that that's the case. You also find proof that there's a number of Jesus followers that exponentially grew in number after the crucifixion, and all of them say it's because he resurrected from the dead.
Mm.
Right. So you'll find all of that proof. What that is not going to get you to is, hey, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Right.
Right. All that's going to get you to is, okay, so the Bible talks about real people, real places, real things, probably has some really good moral living. Maybe he was a great teacher. He was legitimately a person. But was he the Son of God? The Bible, while it says he is, the Bible can't definitively prove that.
Right.
Right. So that is where faith comes in. Historical evidence can get you 90% of the way there. But the Bible even self admits faith is required.
Right.
Right. And we are called to have faith in Jesus, not to, know every single detail about his life and have no other option other than it's 100%, what you want right in front of me. You know exactly what Jesus is supposed to be. Faith is required to enter into that relationship. Facts are not going to get you into the relationship.
Right. I believe Rome was a place and it had living, breathing people in it, but that doesn't change anything for me. It just shows me that it's real. So if
Right.
you apply the same logic to the Bible, like, yeah, there were real people in it, including Jesus. He was an actual man and he walked places that still exist today. That doesn't alone change anything
Right.
unless you decide in the faith portion.
Right. But the truth is, it's not just a faith that'll get you there. It's a faith experience that'll
Mm-hmm.
get you there. Because at the end of the day, even if I didn't have any historical evidence, even if all of that was stripped from my mind, the 10% faith experience that I have lived in my own life is enough proof for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that I've experienced God and the way that so many other followers of Jesus have experienced God is a very personal, legitimate, tangible way where we can look at our own lives and the evidence in our own lives, and there's just no other explanation. We can only have so many coincidences.
Right.
And eventually coincidence become the explanation of, oh, what a coincidence just becomes nonsense. Right? Like the only answer is God,
Yeah.
Like that's the only thing that makes sense
Right.
when nothing else makes sense.
Yeah. And I think back to kind of how we started this conversation, if you're listening and you're thinking, like that's kind of the timeline for me, I mean, speaking from myself personally, I I started asking questions after I had already experienced, faith. Like I was asking questions about the Bible and its reliability and the legitimacy of everything that it says because I had an experience with faith. Like, I really genuinely experienced God in my life and saw things line up for me that just didn't make sense and couldn't explain any other way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people come to these questions in that order. But even if you're on the other side of the spectrum, like, that doesn't mean that you are disqualified from experiencing faith, you
No.
know?
No, not at all. I think what we find is that the faith journey is very personal,
Mhm.
and that there's many different ways for us to jump on to a faith journey. However, Jesus is the only way for that journey to extend forever,
Mhm.
right? And that there's a lot of baggage and experiences and life issues and, just turmoil or lack of turmoil. Everything was just too easy. So I don't even know why I would need God. Like, there's a lot of different ways that we come to a place to ask ourselves, is this legit or not?
Right.
And that's fine. The important thing is, number one, don't just trust a pastor or your parents or your grandparents just because you love them.
Mhm.
Um, don't just trust the articulate, you know, friend of yours that just logically can make a lot of sense with a different worldview either. You do the work,
Yeah.
right? You do the work because at the end of the day, it's your life. And according to what the Bible says, it's your eternity,
Mhm.
right? And you deserve a real answer, not one that's spoon fed to you, not one that's forced down your throat. You deserve to fall asleep on your pillow at night knowing that you are comfortable with the answer that you've uncovered.
Right.
And people make mistakes. Um, People get emotionally tied into certain things and they lead people astray. And we don't want to take that chance. We want to do the work ourselves as best we can to make a well informed decision about the significance or the insignificance of Jesus.
Right.
And that's your choice. And our church exists to give people that opportunity to become well informed. And obviously, it's difficult. I mean, we're biased. I feel like I'm well informed and have made a good decision. And so, me wanting to create that opportunity for other people are like, well, yeah, but you're slanted in one way. Well, just because I'm slanted in one way doesn't qualify me from having a passion for someone else to discover on their own time and in their own way the
Right.
same thing I've discovered. I mean, that just makes no sense. Um, and plus that also assumes that you know what I found isn't right, and from what I've found, it's right.
Yeah.
Which is difficult in our society to say, well, that's rude of you. But I don't know what to do with. I mean, it's like it's a hot summer day, and we're traveling through the jungle, and I found this perfectly spring fed pool and I know it's there. And I go back to all my friends who are traipsing through the mosquito infested and they're just hot. And I can tell them, hey, I found this thing. Right. Well, and I'm telling them, no, let's go to this and let's take a break. And like, no, well, we're trying to get to this. They're like, well, no, this is great. Like in the middle of that moment, well, of course I'm biased. It's because I've experienced this over here.
Right.
I'm not going to pretend that what I experienced wasn't incredible just because you haven't experienced it. And because I'm afraid that the vision you have of where you want to go is different. I'm just letting you know what I've experienced. And I'm trying to say the experience I had was so incredible. There's something in me that just says, if I care about you, I want you to experience it too. But I don't want to drag you.
Right.
I
It's
don't want
like
to drag you over there.
I wandered over here and I found something incredible. All you all I'm asking is that you maybe give it a shot. Like,
Yeah.
you take that trail and see if it is what I say it is,
Mhm.
you know? I think it's okay to have your mind made up.
Yes.
It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to try and change your mind when your mind is made up, you know?
Yes.
I think you have to let people have that process.
Mhm.
You can't just assume like, hey, if you're going to hang out with us, you need to be on the same page. It's a little bit, that doesn't make sense. They don't really think the same way if
Right.
that's what you're asking of somebody when they show up, you know?
Right. And the truth is that when someone begins to change their mind, even if you don't allow them to do it, it still happened.
Right.
Right. So if you're uncomfortable with people asking questions, causing them to stop, getting them to stop asking the questions actually isn't stopping the questions.
No.
It just means that you're not aware they're asking it. The questions are still being asked.
Right.
They're being uncomfortable with a belief or a lack of belief or fill in the blank, whatever it is. That's still legitimate. It's just now we've squashed it so much and suppressed it to where we pretend because it makes us more comfortable not to discuss it. But inside the person, the question is still there.
Right.
And they might say, well, I suppressed it and I just forced myself to believe. No, I mean, that's not the way it works. No,
No.
the doubt is still sitting there.
Yeah.
And I don't want anyone, don't let anyone tell you, just shut up and believe. Don't let anybody say that. And at the same time, don't let anyone say, you know, oh, that's nonsense. Who wants to believe in a guy who fell from heaven and saved the world and then flew back up and is going to come back again one day? What an idiot.
Right.
Don't let anybody tell you that. You figure that. If that's your conclusion, that's your conclusion. I don't think that will be your conclusion. But if it is, goodness, get to it by doing the work on your own. Don't let
Yeah.
somebody intimidate you into that worldview. Because, and I know I've said it a couple of times, you're just worth more than that. You are worth making your own mind up and doing your own investigation. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're in a place where it's like you have experienced some kind of undeniable, like, spirituality, like, I think you can feel a little uncomfortable when you get the answer on the other side of the spectrum where it's like, yeah, that's a fairy tale. Because you're like, no, there's something more. Like, there's something different about life that
Yeah.
I haven't discovered yet. And I can feel it. I can feel it in the words, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that there are people in that place. We know there are people listening to this that's like, yeah, this is all a fairy tale. We know that there are people who are living their life, believing that Jesus is who he says he is, and living to honor God, you know? And so there's so many different people listening, and we hope that these conversations facilitate some kind of discovery in all of those people.
Yes.
And so we want to know what questions you have that may help in that. We'd love to be a resource. We'd love to, you know, pick each other's brains on it, you
Sure.
know? So if you have any questions or comments, or you want to buy us another coffee, apparently I'm not asking for coffee. We didn't even know that could happen. So,
Didn't know it.
but you can text podcast to, you want to tell us the number?
678-661-6330.
Yep. So just text podcast and we'll get your submission and we'll read it over and take it into consideration.
That's it. Or you can leave a comment.
Yeah. And you can leave a comment.
Yeah.
But thanks for joining us on this episode. I think we're on episode 4.
How about that?
Made it 4 episodes.
Boom.
But thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.